Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and in this video we're going to once again discuss some of the recent discoveries in regards to the formation of complex life on planet Earth, which of course even today is still a fundamental mystery in modern biology. And specifically we're going to focus on the question of, well, where exactly our cells came from, and how did certain structures appear inside of them. And this is of course a part of an ongoing series where I've been kind of investigating this for the past few years, and some of the previous parts you can find in the links in the description below. But today we're going to take a look at something that's extremely difficult to explain, but something that's extremely important. We're going to discuss the origin of cell nucleus, the central control room that contains our DNA and that pretty much all complex cells contain, but none of the bacteria have them, and so it's not entirely clear where exactly it came from. But to start, I guess let's discuss some of the previous discoveries and what we already know about all of this, and briefly discuss the ideas that you can generally find in most high school biology textbooks. Something that most students learn about, referred to as endosymbiotic theory. This essentially explains how some of the primitive ancestors that eventually formed complex life at some point started to swallow bacteria that eventually created a cooperation with that particular host and acquired certain functions inside of it. The best example is of course mitochondria. There's a lot of evidence that mitochondria used to be its own bacteria until it got swallowed by something else. And for quite a lot of organelles and a lot of structures inside the cell, we can generally trace back their origin to something else involving bacteria or primordial archaea. But when it comes to the origin of nucleus itself, here this is a little bit more unclear. There are actually at least 4 different propositions, and pretty much all of them are highly debated. But there are some things that we know for sure. For example, we know that most eukaryotic cells, or most complex cells, or possibly even all of them, descended from a group of organisms referred to as Asgard archaea. This is an organism I've discussed previously in one of the videos in the description, and this is actually a more recent discovery from less than 10 years ago. So basically right here you're looking at one of our super ancient ancestors. But if we look at this compared to a human cell, there is a massive gap in terms of complexity and structure, despite a lot of similarities in terms of genetics. And so trying to piece together the actual evolutionary history has basically been a goal for a lot of different studies in the last decade. And today we're going to take a look at a new study where a team of researchers from Japan and the United States discovered something that nobody knew existed until recently. A really strange looking virus. And it just so happens that this particular virus, now referred to as Ushikuvirus, provides some of the strongest evidence we have for a fascinating but somewhat controversial idea referred to as viral eukaryogenesis. Basically a hypothesis from approximately 20 years ago that suggested that cell nucleus is actually an ancient virus, or it was a virus a long time ago. And so let's talk about the study and this idea in more detail, and talk about the evidence as well. But to understand why this is important and what this idea is all about, we basically have to go back to 2001. Here Professor Masaharu Takemura and Dr. Philip Bell independently proposed this idea that the eukaryotic nucleus potentially began as a massive virus, and specifically a large DNA virus similar to pox virus that somehow infected an ancient archaea and then somehow decided to stay. Now normally when a virus infects a cell, it first replicates and then eventually kills the host. But in this particular scenario something else seems to have happened. Instead of killing the cell, somehow this virus decided to set up a long-term home inside the cytoplasm. And it seems to have done so successfully that after millions of years, it eventually acquired a very important function. Now this probably started because this virus was very likely stealing and capturing a lot of essential genes and then using them for its own purpose. But then somehow this kind of became beneficial to both the virus and the cell, and so they created a kind of a symbiosis. And after billions of years, this became a prominent membrane-bound structure we now refer to as the nucleus. And by 2003, this idea has gained a lot of momentum, especially once the scientists discovered giant DNA viruses. These are not your typical tiny viruses, they're actually very massive and very complex. And when they infect different organisms such as amoeba, instead of just killing the amoeba, they create what's known as a viral factory, or a viroplasm. You can actually see them in this image in green. And these factories are sometimes wrapped in the membrane and even act as dedicated sites for DNA replication, which in terms of function seems to act remarkably similar to a typical nucleus. And so this by itself was already quite exciting. But this brings us to this recent discovery of a new virus. Here, in a recent study by Professor Takemura, a team discovered a new giant virus from the lake referred to as Ushiku, which is basically why it's named Ushikuvirus. This virus belongs to a family referred to as Mammonoviridae, and it seems to specifically infect a type of a single-cell microorganism referred to as vermamoeba. These are amoeba that kind of look like this. And what makes this virus kind of exciting is actually its shape. When researchers looked at this under very powerful microscopes, and when they analyzed its function and how it infects these amoeba, they discovered that it seems to contain what's known as a icosahedral shape. It has 20 sides, and it's also covered in these very short spikes that you see in this image. But unlike its relatives, these spikes have very unique caps and even very long filamentous extensions, which in terms of appearance already made it quite unique and quite different. Now here it doesn't actually resemble a typical nucleus that much, but there are some similarities. But the most interesting part is not in how it looks, but how it behaves. When the Ushikuvirus infects a cell, it causes what's referred to as a cytopathic effect. Basically, it causes the amoeba to suddenly become incredibly large, increasing in size dramatically. And most importantly, unlike other viruses such as, for example, Medusa virus we discussed previously, Ushikuvirus disrupts the host's nuclear membrane and causes the membrane to change during the replication process. And while to the researchers behind the study, this is a kind of a missing link for a very important bridge between different types of giant viruses. And that's because we know that different giant viruses seem to interact with the host by causing a lot of different effects. Some of these viruses use the host's intact nucleus as a factory, while others, like Pandora virus for example, completely destroy it. And here Ushikuvirus sits right in the middle. It essentially shows us a potential evolutionary path of how some viruses might have interacted with and eventually managed the entire cell from within. Basically here the virus is able to completely take over the genetic material and then control the host, causing it to do things it could not do otherwise. But why do biologists believe that all of this very likely eventually led to the production of nucleus? Or basically what exactly points to the viral origin inside our own cells? And this comes down to what's known as the central dogma proteins. These are basically proteins responsible for the most basic tasks of life, such as replicating DNA and transcribing it into RNA. And a lot of recent studies show that many of these proteins we use seem to be much more closely related to viral proteins than those in bacteria or archaea. In other words, for example, enzymes like DNA polymerase, that's extremely important in DNA replication, seems to be phylogenetically connected to exactly the same group of giant viruses, implying that the protein itself and the DNA behind this protein came from some kind of a giant virus a long time ago, with the additional important function present inside our cells being referred to as mRNA capping. This is something that many eukaryotes use to protect the genetic messages. Basically here the RNA molecule is modified to protect it inside the cell. And this feature is totally absent in basically all bacteria and of course archaea. But, once again, giant viruses like mimivirus seem to contain the machinery for this mRNA capping. Once again implying that this particular function seems to have come from a giant virus that must have been inside the cell. And this of course suggests that many of these different functions might have been acquired as a kind of a complex upgrade from various massive viral infections back in the days. Infections that eventually became permanent and introduced a new function. And so the discovery of this very strange virus in a Japanese lake once again changes our understanding of the tree of life, confirming that viruses are not just parasites and not just something dangerous, but were indeed primary drivers for life's major transitions. Something that we did discuss in some of the previous videos in the description, with many studies confirming that at least 7% of all DNA inside of us is viral in origin. As a matter of fact, viruses are super important for human reproduction, but this also provides us with a kind of a practical medical side. And that's because certain species of amoeba can be extremely dangerous. For example, something referred to as amoebic encephalitis has actually killed a few people in the last few years when amoeba gets inside person's brain and eats it from within. And in this case, this could be the solution. By studying how these giant viruses infect and destroy amoeba, we might be able to develop extremely effective techniques on how to prevent and stop these deadly infections. And so definitely quite an exciting study. But still, the most interesting part of the study is the fact that this points at the potential origin of nucleus and the importance of viruses, and specifically giant viruses, in the evolution of complexity of early cells. Now right now this is just a hint, but based on these studies, it looks like ancient archaea that were already collecting a lot of bacteria inside may also have been infected by a giant virus and started to coexist with various bacteria that slowly transitioned into a permanent structure, thus becoming a nucleus. And so when you combine an Asgard archaea with a protobacterium and a giant virus, you eventually get something that kind of resembles a complex cell, including a human cell. Or at least that's one of the conclusions from one of these recent studies. But because these giant viruses are technically a more recent discovery, and we still don't really know much about them, we'll definitely come back and discuss some of the other studies in some of the future videos. But I guess just to make this clear, this is still a hypothesis. The debate is technically still continuing, and biologists are still not entirely certain where nucleus came from. But this reminds us that the history of life is not just a straight line. It seems to be a very complex web of interactions, mergers, and infections, which basically makes you and me literally a biological mosaic. We're kind of a mishmash of different stuff that evolved for billions of years. And if you'd like to find out more, check out videos in the description about all of the previous discoveries. On that note, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM it directly, or by joining the channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying a Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.